Joining me now is Global Affairs Analyst Calvin Dark to discuss this story further. He joins me from Rabat, Morocco. Good to see you, Calvin. And the current chair of the African Union has held negotiation talks with President Vladimir Putin to end his war operations in Ukraine. Do you think a united African voice in opposition to Russia would be a powerful one?
Well, it could be because there's a lot of power in the bloc of African countries. But I think that probably the bigger question is what will it cost African countries? Because one of the dynamics that many countries in Africa have been dealing with is while they may not have agreed or don't agree with Putin's action in Ukraine, they also know that they depend on Russia, some for military support, others for energy and other really, really important resources. And it's doubtful that the West is going to step in to fill that gap if they do tarnish those relationships with Russia. So it could have an effect, but I think the more important point is what's going to happen after it for African countries.
And if you put that question, to the relationship which Russia has built over the years with some African governments, facing violent insurgency or political instability, would you say the significance of these ties could play a major role in how these countries respond to Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
Yes, totally, because at the end of the day, money and financial arrangements are a really big factor in the decisions that nations make. And that's not just in Africa, in the United States and anywhere else. So I think that many countries have weighed what they need in their relationships with Russia, be it resources and financial relationships, with their standing in the international community. Because one of the other factors is if they are on the side of Russia or are in the middle or abstaining or not really speaking out one way or the other, how is that going to affect their relationships with other Western countries or with the United States? So it's a very, very, very thin tightrope they have to walk because there's a lot to consider.
Already the way you painted it puts Africa on a very tight rope. You don't know whether to stay on the fence or be in the middle. Now, do you see African Union now, the AU, coming having some form of difficulty in establishing itself as a powerful entity in opposing Russia?
I think the actions by the African Union, the call with the president of Senegal when he was talking today, I think those are actions that are necessary and they're good. And I think that builds credibility for the African Union internationally. But I also think that there's a ways to go before the African Union can have that credibility internationally, because a lot of people point to crises happening on the continent where the African Union hasn't exactly been a force for peace or good or resolution. So I think they should say it, but I also think we should have a measured expectation of what the world will say about what the African Union says, or what credibility they'll put in what the African Union promises it will do.
Calvin, quickly here, do you see this, coming to an end anytime soon? Because at the moment, African countries are still evacuating their citizens. I think the very latest is about 7 to 9 Zambians that have just returned home.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the other dynamics that African countries felt, and I as an African American member of the African diaspora felt when we saw those images of how people that look like us were treated a lot differently when they were trying to flee the Ukraine. That's something that the world, Africa and me and other people in the US aren't going to soon forget. And I think that that's going to be one of the lasting effects of this. And I think that that's going to factor in how Africa responds with this situation. As far as how it will be resolved, I think that's going to depend on how much Putin is willing to lose and risk before he says it's enough. And I think that will come from the Russian people.
And again, this, which you just painted, calls to question the education sector across the continent, across Africa, because a big percentage of these people are actually students schooling in Ukraine.
Yes, and and I think that's one of the things that many countries in Africa in particular are going to have to consider that, there is absolutely nothing wrong with studying abroad and getting an education out of your country. I am an American and I got my education outside of the United States. But when there are situations like this, you want to make sure that the systems in your country can support the aspirations of students. And so I think that's something that should be a long-term goal for African countries and, in fact, many countries around the world.
Lastly, let me ask you your thoughts. You're a global analyst. A lot of people are already thinking that the United States and some other NATO countries pushed Ukraine into what they call a needless war.
Well, I would say that the United States and Western countries drew a very clear line, and Russia crossed it. And I think what we're seeing now with the sanctions and the unification, which I have to say, the unification we've seen so far between Western countries and the United States is more than I thought it would be. And I think that that shows that Putin crossed the line that they drew in the sand, so to speak. However, as we enter into days and days of this conflict, we have to see if Western countries and the United States are going to back it up to deter Putin from going forward, and hopefully he'll retreat and end this crisis.
Calvin Duck, many thanks for speaking with us.
Thank you.